Hey everybody, Asher here with another look at the meta in Hearthstone Standard Mode. Especially going into the new season, I think it's worthwhile to reevaluate a video that I did when Whispers of the Old Gods released, especially now that the dust has settled. The cards have kind of been examined, mulled over, new archetypes appearing, other archetypes disappearing. So we're going to talk a little bit about what I got right in the last video, a little bit about what I got wrong in the last video, and take a look at the classes as a whole and rank them, because it wouldn't be Hearthstone if we weren't ranking things constantly. Keep in mind this is based on class, not based on decks, although plenty of classes do run multiple decks. And one of the things that I've kind of been most impressed with Whispers of the Old Gods is that each class, even Priest, has a deck that I would call viable for laddering. Preferable? Not necessarily. But you can do it, so at least nobody's a total dumpster fire. But that said, real quick, where was I right in the video last time? I was high on Warrior going into Whispers of the Old Gods, and I've been vindicated. Warrior is strong. Cthulhu Warrior is a thing I'd say possibly the strongest of the Cthulhu decks that exist. Shaman, we all knew was coming, but its strength is largely based on the cards it already had. There were a few things that improved, but it's still very much a mid-range deck. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And I also said that Zoo would still be a thing, would still be strong, despite a lot of the cards disappearing that may have been Zoo staples previously, and that is correct. Things that I got wrong, I think one of the biggest things that I need to sort of knock my head for is Miracle Rogue coming back. I should have known. I played Hearthstone back when Miracle was big before, because I got dumped on playing Priest on it by a bit. And what cards made Miracle go away? All the Death Rattles, including Sludge Belcher, but especially Lotheb. Those cards got cycled out. I should have seen it coming. The other things that I got wrong that really surprised me was Face Hunter disappearing. Like, just, you don't see Face Hunter anywhere. It is really strange. Maybe someone will bring it back, but I'm not sure. Face Hunter is just not the archetype that maybe it used to be. And then also, I didn't really consider N'Zoth as being an archetype building card, because I thought the meta would be faster than it turned out being, at least early on in Whispers of the Old Gods. Although that may be changing. And N'Zoth is still a very good card in of itself, but there's the caveat that we are in still a developing meta, and just because we have this report here at the beginning of June 2016 doesn't mean things can change. But still, we're going to go with our class list here, starting with number 1 ranking, which is still Warrior. Now, I am listing 2 decks here, and this is going to be the only class that has 2 decks listed here, although there are a number of decks that are viable for Warrior. Tempo Warrior, which I have on the left, Cthulhu Warrior, which is to the right of it, and then there's also Dragon Tempo, standard regular control that doesn't feature Cthulhu, and the card that I've chosen to illuminate here, and I'm going to do this for each class, is kind of a semi-MVP, is Ravaging Ghoul, a 2-for-1 card here. You need your Whirlwind, you need a 3/3 body, amazing tempo card, dumps on Zoo in a lot of aggro decks as well, helps you cycle, which is very important in a lot of Warrior decks. They're pretty much all taking the Patron shell. Patron, which is still very strong, but you hardly ever see on ladder at all. Some of the things we may be looking forward to with Warrior as well, it's really strong because Fiery War Axe is just so good. And because it does have that initial Patron shell that lets it cycle through cards really quickly, Execute is incredibly efficient removal, and Warrior is always very good at getting to its win conditions. If there's some things that we may see merging kind of in the coming trends here, I think it's going to be that Cthulhu Warrior may sort of creep its way more towards standard control Warrior. It's very strong because of brand plays that you get with Ancient Shield Bearer and Twin Emperors. But if there is one thing that can make the deck even stronger, people have been tinkering with, and it could work out, doing a Cthulhu-less version, because you can still get your Cthulhu buffs in and not have the big eyeball there. Will it work out better? I'm not sure, but one piece of tech that's been really fascinating and helpful for me with Cthulhu Warrior is Emperor Thorician. But that said, let's get to number 2. Warrior's kind of straightforward. Number 2 is also pretty straightforward, and that is Shaman. Shaman is a class that also has 2 pretty standard archetypes here. One being Face, which we're all fairly familiar with, but the one that's maybe surprised me a little bit, that's gotten actually a bit stronger, is not some spell variant using Hail Azeel, and not actually the bunch of evolved decks that you saw early, but good old-fashioned, consistent Totem Shaman, which the number 1 bit of advice I've seen people give for playing this deck is that if you don't think it's strong enough, Totem more. And that's why the MVP card I've pulled for here is Tuskar Totemic, a card that a lot of people said could work, in theory is very good, in from the grand tournament, and this is finally its time to shine because of Thing from Below. If you can get more totems out, you can make all kinds of things very powerful, including a 0-cost Thing from Below. And Tuskar Totemic, it puts out a body and it puts out a totem, and that totem can be any totem in Standard, including Totem Golem, which is kind of the dream, or Fling Tongue Totem, or Manatide Totem. Those are all pretty good, but any totem you cast decreases cost. Primal Fusion as a one-off is surprisingly strong in this deck as well. That was a card I completely dismissed. But you have your 2 archetypes for Shaman that hang out pretty well, and I've even seen some aggro Shamans tech in things like Elemental Destruction, which is fascinating to me, but is a kind of big risky comeback card. Still, Warrior 1, Shaman 2, that hasn't changed. Class number 3's bumped up quite a bit though, and that's Warlock, mainly on the back of Zoo. Reno Warlock is also still something that's present. I've seen a lot of people try and make it work in tournaments. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Cthulhu Warlock doesn't really seem to be quite a thing that's working out very well, and I can do a separate video for why Cthulhu decks maybe aren't where we thought they'd be. But Zoo on the other hand, I thought it would be good. Darkshire Councilman, on top of liking the art, I thought it would be very powerful. I've even seen complaints on Reddit for people saying they hate Possessed Villager because that means they know they're facing Zoo. So I was right on all accounts for most of what I said previously. But regardless, Zoo is pretty much what's bringing this up to 3, and these top 3 classes are kind of the top of your tier list to a point. If there are some things that I've seen some more people experiment with Zoo, and this is a more standard list, although it doesn't have Gormuk in it. One thing that you are starting to see is some people throwing Leroy as a finisher again. Not necessarily Leroy with the power overwhelming Thurician Faceless Manipulator, because that's way too slow for this deck, but just Leroy as a standard finisher of itself, pretty interesting. But these cards, these decks are kind of the metagame defining top list. They're very strong on their own. They have a lot of good matchups. They can all take games that they otherwise have no business taking, and everyone else is kind of scrambling to build decks to counter them, which gets to part 4, which there's not nearly the drop off on the tier list that I had from the last video. This next on the list is Rogue, and Rogue, I think the reason really that I'm not putting it in tier 1 is that Warrior is so prominent and Miracle Rogue kind of struggles to that extent. So Miracle Rogue, the class that the archetype that I did not see coming back, and that was just incredibly stupid of me. N'Zoth Rogue, on the other hand, is something that is kind of creeping on the fringes. I don't have a deck list here because I haven't been able to find kind of a good modern past the first few weeks of Whispers of the Old Gods N'Zoth Rogue, but I do think that's something that has some potential to come back now that people are starting to figure out that N'Zoth is more about bringing back bigger cards, but you can't just play all the Death Rattles, because in Standard, Death Rattles are not nearly as strong as in Wild, so you can't throw everything in there. But about Miracle, why do I have Edwin Van Cleef featured here? Well, that's partially because silences are mostly gone, and so Van Cleef is now back at a place where you can shine. When I was dabbling into Miracle Rogue once upon a time, you throw Van Cleef out, he gets silenced, and it was just a 3 for 2/2. You made a fancy play. That's not so much how it is in Standard right now. Now, granted, there's plenty of counter cards: Entomb, Shadow Word Death, Sap, Hex, Polymorph. Yes, that's true. But the thing about Van Cleef is that he's a pressure card that forces people to use some kind of that premium removal. If they can't remove it, or if you can conceal him, awesome. If you can, then that makes your Auctioneers all the better. So that's Miracle Rogue, which is still very powerful. Number 5 on the list may be a little bit controversial because it is one of the few classes on here that's just kind of one deck, one archetype, and that's what brings it down a little bit. But that's Hunter. Hunter is a class that I've seen a lot of. I think the general review consensus I've seen on Reddit and other places for Hunter is, I don't know why this deck's so good. It seems like crap, but I keep losing to it. The answer to that is the card that I have featured here, Call of the Wild, a card that can win games by itself. Who knew summoning the 3 animal companions would be, well, very powerful, especially since you can run 2 of them. It's not a legendary spell, it's an epic. So running 2 of them, if you can just make it to turn 8 or turn 9 or turn 10, that's generally when Call of the Wild can take the game, assuming you have any kind of board. Now, there's some other kinds of hunters that are floating around there. N'Zoth Hunter is a deck that's still being tinkered with. It's good. It's probably not going to be as good as mid-range Hunter, just because mid-range can still get some value out of actually shocking or hitting people with the hero power. But the other one that fascinates me a little bit more is Lock and Load Yogg-Saron Hunter, which I've seen plenty of people have success with. Unfortunately, I can't speak to it very much because I don't actually have Lock and Load, but that's something to look out for, and I can definitely look for a list to show you all in the comments if you'd like. Number 6 on the list here is a class that's actually risen out of the crap hole part of the tier, the bottom tier, which is Paladin. But even then, I think its position here is a little bit tenuous to a point. What I have listed here is a N'Zoth Control Paladin deck. And that was a deck that was kind of the new hotness a few weeks ago from Tempo Storm's meta report saying, hey, this deck's really good. It's tier 1. Craft it, craft it, craft it. Spend all zillion of your dust on it. The fact of the matter is that it is a good deck, but it puts very little pressure on your opponent. So if you have something like Zoo or Shaman that can get a lot of stuff on the board, even Tempo Warrior, you can usually beat things out before the big N'Zoth turn. Plus, it flat out loses to Priest because Entomb just takes it up. Point being is that N'Zoth decks, you'll see that a lot of the classes that rely on N'Zoth decks are kind of going a little lower, and I think part of that's just the trend that we're getting where the metagame is speeding up as we figure out these decks a little more. People are trying to tune their decks to get that win a little bit faster. That's why more people are teching in Leroy Jenkins than before to try and take that win before the other people can, and that hurts Control Paladin because Control Paladin wants to run the game out as long as possible. So I do have Ragnaros Light Lord here because he is a fantastic card, not only because he yells Live Insect, but just because he is a great body as well. It's like a Light Well that's 8/8 that can actually choose what it attacks, so you don't have to even worry about the Ragnaros RNG. You can keep that ever in your favor. If there is something to look out for with Paladin, though, and I don't have it listed here, but I did mention last video that weenie decks would probably start to see their way into the Paladin eventually. There's a lot of Divine Favor shenanigans you can do, and that is starting to take shape. All it's really going to take, I think, is like some prominent streamer or person like that to really make a big push, and we'll start seeing some of the more tiny minion Paladins. Not anything like an Infant Paladin, which is a very strictly slow control deck, but we're talking more of the faster tiny minion variety. I hope that made sense. Next on the list is a class that it could be poised to shoot back up because it's not weak, even though it's at the bottom of the middle tier here, but that's Mage. And I think the reason that I'd overrated Mage was that I really thought that Freeze Mage would survive the transition from regular all formats to standard format, and Freeze Mage has not done very well. I mean, it's a deck that still works functionally, but it's just not very good. And that's saying something because Freeze Mage was very much a thing even before you had stuff like a Mad Scientist, because Freeze Mage was a thing back in the Classic era and the Beta era. I think what changes is that you have a lot of classes that can heal their way out, plus people just know how to play against it. Tempo Mage is very strong as well, which is why I have Flame Waker here, because I think every Tempo Mage I face gets a little tiny Sorceress Apprentice out, and then gets a Flame Walker out turn 3, and then cast all their 1-mana spells, and that's their opening hand, and it destroys me. And Tempo Mage actually has some very good matchups with some of the higher tier classes, so I think that's something to look out for. The list that I have here, though, is a Bars Reno Jackson Mage. I think this is going to be one of the things that you look for, kind of what trends are looking at, how people are trying to improve a class, make it work better. And I think Reno Mage, Grinder Mage, is something that is both fun and interesting, and you could probably see it maybe more in tournaments, but definitely more in laddering. It's one of those good shock decks that can kind of weather the storm and take people off guard. Warning, though, it does have a pretty poor matchup against Zoo, so if you're facing a lot of Zoo, I wouldn't recommend it, as most Reno decks tend to lose before you can get your Reno out or even keep it relevant. But still, Mage is kind of in an interesting place because I definitely would call it middle tier. I definitely overfigured how strong it would be. But Tempo Mage is poised to kind of have a breakout if everyone starts continuing to play their Warrior and their Zoo, and to a lesser extent Rogue. But I think Reno Mage is going to have a place in the coming month as well. But then we get to the lower tier of things. And once again, this is not to say these classes are bad. It's just that they're worse than the other ones. So there's my old teacher days. Again, first up we have Druid, which is solidly in position 8. So what's up, Druid? What we have here is Savage's Yogg-Saron token Druid, which I think is probably going to be one of the best archetypes going forward once more people tend to sort of get behind the fact that Yogg-Saron's a very good comeback card. But Token Druid and Ramp Druid still do exist. It's just the class nerfs hurt so badly, and it's probably going to take a set or two before Druid can kind of recover. Blizzard's been on record saying that they don't want Druid to play the same every expansion. Their core cards are too strong. I can see the reason for nuking that to oblivion, but right now we're having to recover. So how does the Yogg Druid work? It's really all about making your tokens, using things like Power of the Wild to buff them. Even Feral Rage is good in a pinch as a removal. I kind of like it better, find it more situationally useful than Mulch, which is always a roll of the dice for actually destroying things. But that is a pretty good swing as well. But it's definitely play out your tokens, get your scenarios, hopefully things work. Fandral Staghelm's also been an MVP in the deck too, so it's interesting, worth looking at. But the reason I don't have Cthulhu Druid up here is because Cthulhu Druid's just kind of fallen on its face. And what's happened with Cthulhu to a point, like I said, I can highlight this in a different video a little bit later, is that we have just, it's kind of a predictable style of play. You see the Cthulhu minions dropped, you know what the big threats are. The decks have so many slots that already have stuff in them, and it's hard to fit other things in there. It's like, okay, can you deal with the Cthulhu? Congratulations, you've dealt with the deck. And that's kind of the problem. It's easier for new players to play, which is good. Cthulhu's a powerful card, which is good, but the archetype as a whole, it needs something else to win, which is where I think things like Cthulhu Warrior shine a little bit more, because Cthulhu supplements what they do. The win condition is not Cthulhu. Speaking of decks that use Cthulhu that don't do very well, we're looking at the bottom of the list now, and that's Priest. Actually, I'm not featuring a Cthulhu deck here. It's a N'Zoth deck, but Cthulhu Priest is another one of the decks that's probably strongest of the Cthulhu decks, but that's like saying you're king of the trilobites or something. You exist in plenty along a big aeon of something. There's a point there. I'm not sure. Let's just say that Priest is not in a very good spot. And we talked about this at length last time. Velen's Chosen is a card that I miss almost more than Light Bomb. And I think that's because priests so often rely on using their hero power to seal up the early game, and you just don't have that anymore. Now, I did feature here a slightly different N'Zoth list than maybe you may see some other people playing, because N'Zoth Priest is probably the strongest variant if you are going to play it, and it is a deck that can take some matchups, especially if a lot of people start playing Control Paladin. By the way, according to numbers, Control Paladin, one of the least popular decks on ladder because it's expensive and very slow. So don't look for that matchup very often. But N'Zoth Dragon Priest, I'm still a believer. It's still fun to play. It's like any dragon deck. You got to tempo out. You got to draw well. And if you draw well, it's very, very smooth sailing. Plus, you have a bit of Deathwing Dragon Lord for that greed factor, and then N'Zoth the Corruptor to finish the game. So I think that archetype lives. Control Priest is in a very tough spot just because of all the things it lost, but if you're skilled enough, you can definitely make Control Priest work. But the reason this class ranks at the bottom is that everything's just been kind of gutted, and while this is a class that you can ladder with or tournament with, there's just better options out there. That's the long and short of it. So to review our class rankings here, we have 3 tiers as per the usual. This is just based off of class. Keep in mind that some decks in the classes are stronger than others. But top tier belongs to Warrior, Shaman, and Warlock. And then just a little bit of a ways down, we have Rogue. Then we have a little bit more of a fall where we go from Rogue to Hunter and Paladin and then Mage, taking probably the biggest fall of any ranking that I had from last time. And then at the bottom tier, you have Druid and Priest. So that's it for now. This is Asher. We're going to be talking a little bit more in the days to come about kind of where the meta's gone, what some decks are doing. We'll be playing some more Hearthstone here. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if there's anything you think in terms of my rankings, my analysis. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Feel free to subscribe if you want to see more Hearthstone, and we'll do this again soon. Take care.